causes minor problems like world wars. Welcome to the first XSAC for 2014. It's wonderful to see you all here. I know most of you already through the XSA, so hopefully this should be a fairly laid-back thing. Today I'll be talking to you about political science, or more accurately, international relations in the context of political science. If there's one thing I'd like to emphasize right before I start, is that political science is big. There'll be more on that later. So, a lot of you will be wondering exactly what is political science. It's a really good question, and it's one we still don't have an answer to, which is impressive because political science as a subject in different forms has been going for about 2,500 years officially, and it's pretty much always been a thing. Aristotle first defined political science as the study of the state. Nowadays we'd probably call it something completely different, but then again, different political scientists will say totally different things about what political science means. No one's really quite sure. There's a whole heap of things nowadays that we generally accept fall under the ideas of pol sci. At a guess, and depending on who you ask, it really is a very complex topic. But all national politics, international affairs, matters with unions involving government and business interactions, law, seekers, asylum seekers, trade disputes, everything. It is a massive area. It's not like biology, but it's science. It's where science covers biology, physics, all of those things. Political science covers pretty much everything that might involve groups of more than about 3 people speaking to each other. It is an exceptionally complex topic and a very, very hard one to describe in a single XSAC. With this in mind, there is too much to describe in a single XSAC, so I will be talking by far about international relations. It's where I specialise. I'm a second-year student here at the ANU, doing a Bachelor of Arts and Masters of International Affairs, and I have a really keen interest in, obviously, the entire subject of international relations, and hopefully by the end of the degree I'll have a really keen knowledge in international relations, but for the purpose of this XSAC, I'll pretend I've got a flawless one already, and everything I say, as we all know, is absolutely right. I've tried my absolute best to avoid a strong military focus in this XSAC. As people who know me will know, I usually yak on a little too much about wars and how important wars are and what happens in wars. So I'm more or less steering clear of that one. They're important, they'll get mentioned, but they're not the focus, because that's not really what we're here for, or being XSAC about wars. So, to start off, I'd love to tell you a bit about the origins of political science, because it's another thing that no one's really quite sure on. It's existed in huge numbers of forms, and really has been developed individually in different parts of the world over time to create completely different ideas of what political science is, that we've then sort of unified at a later date, and we like to pretend that it's always been the one thing. Aristotle and Thucydides. Aristotle, we all know naturally to be the ancient Greek philosopher. Thucydides, for those of us who don't know, was a very, very famous Greek general, and later also very important writer. He wrote about the Peloponnesian Wars in about, I think it's 420 BC, and was really important for our understanding of ancient military tactics. But he also talked a lot about the relations between the states of ancient Athens, ancient Sparta, and ancient Turkey, or in this case, it was the Persian Empire. This was really important because it developed for the first time in Western, or in writing that the West has access to nowadays, what exactly international relations might be. But he wasn't the only one to be on this bandwagon, and in fact, in the Far East, it had been developed entirely separately over time. Wu Zetian, the Chinese empress, during about 620 AD through about 650, I'm not quite sure on the numbers there, was in fact a very, very important figure for the, I won't say discovery, but the development of international relations in the ancient Chinese dynasties. She, aside from being an amazing figure, I'd actually really recommend reading about her. She started off as a prostitute and ended up as the ruler of probably the greatest empire on earth at the time, which, I mean, that's a pretty cool job advancement. Most people don't see that. But through her writings and then through her policies, by which she actually unified a huge number of the Chinese warlords around the borders of ancient China at the time, was able to create more or less a union between the Chinese states, which fractured about 70 years later. But still, by integrating, discussing and cooperating with those states, and then when that failed, invading them, to massively expand China's power in the region. This was a really big move. Obviously, she was not the first to negotiate or cooperate, but she laid out a set of policies by which this was to be done. It was no longer a slapdash affair of this is how we'll do it today, maybe tomorrow we'll try something else. Now, the essence of international relations in this regard is it's not a case-by-case basis. We try and create overall theories to consider what's happening. We'll say X has happened and Y has resulted because of theory Z. I'll talk about those a little later. It got developed a lot more, of course, as time went on. Some of the really big landmarks, and of course in such a massive time frame, I can only give you some of the landmarks. Writings like Thomas Hobbes' The Leviathan, in which he discusses the nature of the state as it is in Western Europe during the late medieval period. And he states that states can only interact through a theory of absolutism. This idea that the individual within the state subsumes all of his power to a higher authority figure, in this case a totalitarian government ruled by a monarch, and then those people are capable of interacting with each other at a state level, so that Britain, through its monarch, or in that case as it was England and Scotland, can then negotiate or go to war with whatever suits you, with France, because the two monarchs can get together in the same room and talk. This is one of many theories covered in the book, but it's a really important idea. Absolute monarchs have always negotiated with each other, but again, it's this development of the idea of policy and the methods by which this occurs that makes Hobbes' writing really important. It gets developed a little further, but I've got to say not much further. Most people here will have heard of Machiavelli's work, The Prince. I've always referred to it in the same way as we call Sun Tzu's book, The Art of War. I call Machiavelli's The Prince The Art of Common Sense. He says nothing particularly impressive in his book. It's basically, here is how to rule a country in a way that only pisses off the people you need to piss off, and only causes the problems you need to cause, but will get you the right solutions. Really, nothing in there is revolutionary, but at the time, it was a work that was really quickly passed around and became really important for the foreign policy of a lot of states of Europe during that period. A final really big example for a massive jump in the development of IR, and we are jumping through a lot of centuries and a lot more history here, would be, in fact, the rise of Nazism in Germany. And the way that a certain individual we may know, Adolf Hitler, was, depending on certain interpretations, one thing I do need to stress is that this is a very active period of historical debate, but was able to pioneer in gaming the international system in the way it had developed, to abuse the trust of international relations experts and the policies of other nations in order to invade territory, get what he wanted, and in the end cause a bit of a scuffle. It didn't end so well for him. Now, international relations itself, again, developed much more recently than political science as a whole, and only really became a refined art, if you will, or a refined science over the last century. It's always existed in certain forms, but one thing you'll notice is there's a lot of disunity between the examples I've just mentioned. They obviously haven't really communicated, and while there's a certain amount of building on each other, they've always had trouble integrating, and a lot of people have thought of a lot of theories. It only, or what we consider modern international relations theory, only started to develop around the turn of the 20th century. An idea came into play that we nowadays know as realism. This is a theory by which we state that all states, that is, the nations, the big conglomerates of people, will act rationally in a way that defends their own interests. That means that if State A has to screw over State B to get what it wants, that's what it'll do. And the only reason it wouldn't do this is because it wouldn't be worthwhile for it. States in this idea of realism don't care about other states. They're not looking for cooperation, except where it really benefits them. It's the idea of getting to the top of the ladder and sometimes even kicking the guy on the rung below you because you can. It is a very, if you will, selfish theory. It's the idea that nations are inherently selfish and will always be inherently selfish. This is more or less challenged by World War I. World War I don't really need to go into, but one of the things we see is a whole heap of states acting more or less rationally in the lead-up to this war, and again, it's a very lively topic of debate, though it's not as big as this causes of World War II, where states all act in their own interests, and the result is that about 12 million people die, 6 major empires are destroyed, and I think it's 6, somebody can check, that might be 5, and the economy of Europe is pretty much ruined for about 4 or 5 years. 6, thank you. This brings a big change in the way international relations systems work. This idea of realism, which had been the only really popular theory, and which scholars through the government were really practicing, this idea of one for one and all can bugger off, stopped being such a great idea. It's a bit cliche, but everyone really did look at the horror of World War I and say, we need to avoid this. With this in mind, Woodrow Wilson, the American president at the time, set out, and of course it wasn't just him, but he was really the most famous pioneer of it, to create the League of Nations and bring an entirely new school of thought into how nations and states and everyone interact with each other. This idea at the time was called liberalism, and in fact it still is called liberalism, but it's a slightly different set of ideas. But at the time, this was meant to encourage cooperation, negotiation, and diplomacy between states, with war as an absolute last resort instead of war when convenient. The developments of anywhere from human rights through to economies through to warfare technology, or technology used in wars, had made wars far more expensive for anyone to actually prosecute. So that was, or is in terms of human life as well as economic cost. So this idea pretty quickly caught on, except unfortunately in America and in most of the defeated states of World War I. The League of Nations was formed around a 14-point plan, which I won't go into, but more or less ran along the lines of liberté, égalité, and fraternité. The idea that states would attempt to involve discourse, would cooperate with each other through an international organization. It, again, was really good in theory, but unfortunately the League of Nations was fairly fatally flawed. It's up for discussion. One of the things I really do need to emphasize here is that for every argument I've got, somebody can probably I wouldn't say contradict, but certainly argue against everything I'm saying here. Most things I'm saying here, some of it's pretty established. But the League of Nations certainly had very serious flaws. And unfortunately, as we probably know, this led to one or two minor incidents down the road. Liberalism, as an idea of cooperation for the mutual benefit of all states, ran along fairly decent lines until the 1930s. The 1930s, the Great Depression, was a major shake-up, but multiple incidents that happened throughout the 20s and 30s really fractured this idea that states could work together. For the most part, totalitarian governments, and governments that hadn't been included in the League of Nations, that is, the governments of Germany, the USSR, and later Italy once it pulled out, Japan, for a number of reasons, partly because of racism that had been built into the League. This idea that we'll all work together unless you're black or Asian, because you don't count, began to really badly fracture it. In 1935, Italy withdraws from the League after invading another League member, Abyssinia. This was a fairly clear sign to most of the people paying attention that this idea of liberalism in its form was failing badly. We see this very, very quickly a few years later. The lead up to World War II, liberalism really doesn't work, unfortunately, in the way it's applied. A policy known as appeasement, an incredibly controversial topic for historians nowadays, is used in an attempt to, I suppose, placate, again, even the language I use here will upset a lot of people, Nazi Germany in the lead up to World War II to prevent another war like World War I. People use war as an absolute last resort, going through the ideas of liberalism, negotiation, diplomacy at an international level, right up through to Munich in 1938, an agreement where part of Czechoslovakia, which is mostly occupied by Germans, is actually given to Germany without Czechoslovakia's consent. Britain and France just agree with Germany, but not asking Czechoslovakia to give Germany part of that country, because they can see a global war on the horizon and they're really trying to stop it. As we discover, it doesn't work. The reasons appeasement doesn't work are varied and still argued about, so I won't really go into them there. But World War II brings about a complete change in the system yet again. With the breakout of war, everything goes to hell. We all know I'm not really going to cover World War II. It doesn't have much to do with international relations theory. That's all about the military. But then, of course, at the end of World War II, we jump straight into the Cold War. The Cold War sees the massive resurgence of realism. Liberalism didn't work. Liberalism caused World War II. Liberalism is a massive source of issues. We can't trust the Reds to work with liberalism, so we've got to presume that it's us versus them. The result is sort of two strange coalitions where you've got more or less NATO, or if you will, the First World, as it was used at the time, Western nations effectively, were sort of practicing internal liberalism, where they all worked with friends, but only because there was a giant communist nations, or a group of nations out in the East, if you will, that were threatening them. And in the East, you've got a large number of nations who practice cooperation and liberalism because you've got a great big group of capitalist nations to the West that are threatening them. So you get sort of this microcosm of two liberal systems engaged in entirely realist activities, where they constantly threaten each other, constantly bring themselves to the verge of war, and really the only reason that diplomacy comes through instead of warfare is because of nuclear weapons. There is an entire section of international relations theory that is devoted entirely to looking at nuclear weapons and how they've changed the face of modern diplomacy. It's a complex and really interesting area. In the modern day, we've seen a different kind of international relations develop yet again, one that's somewhere between the two systems. With the fall of the USSR and the development and expansion of groups like the United Nations and the European Union, we've definitely seen the resurgence of what we call modern-day liberalism, where, once again, we're beginning to look at cooperation more or less partly because it's mutually beneficial, partly as a last resort. We realised that war, if we thought it was deadly and too expensive to handle in 1914 to 1918, could now mean the annihilation of the human race. We're a little more keen to avoid it on any kind of large scale. That means that we are prepared to talk and work together. Who'd have thought that that's all we needed? And we really bring around now this idea that we're not just looking at what's happened in the past, but we're also trying to apply it to the future. We are trying our absolute best to examine the development of events over history and then say, right, with this information in mind and examining liberalist theory, realist theory, or a number of other theories that are popular but not as important, if you will, or as resoundingly popular as liberalism and realism, to actually figure out what's going to happen in the future. That's more or less the history of it. So the next question is, how's it useful and where can we use it? It's a really interesting situation now, because one of the things you might have noticed from all of that lengthy description is that it only ever mentions the state. And one thing that we probably all notice nowadays is the state is not the only thing around anymore. Through major intergovernmental organizations, the UN and the EU, we see the development of huge bodies that have a considerable amount of power, but don't belong to any one state. This is an interesting situation, and then there's also the corporate side of things, where now many corporations out-earn most nations in, say, Africa, and some in Southeast Asia or Central Asia. The question is, at what point does a corporate body have as much sway as a nation with defined borders and government? And it's one that we really don't quite have the answer to yet. Realism usually states that what happens is that these institutions have no real power. They're forced to kowtow to the state. The state can bully them into submission when it needs to, and usually it's working towards the state's ends anyway. Examples of this, for previous examples, we've seen groups like the East India Trading Company in the 1700s, and I think very early 1800s, I'm not quite sure, had been working for the British Empire, but when it became too powerful, the empire simply dissolved it. It took all of its territories, it fired a lot of its members, though it gave them really fancy gold parachutes, and it took control back from a company it saw as getting too powerful. For more modern and probably relevant examples, it would claim that something like the UN is powerless. The argument being there that because the UN, particularly through the Security Council, which is by far its most powerful bodies, is still held to account by 5 states at any given time. Any one of those 5, if it doesn't like what's going on, just says, no, I veto it. And thus, nothing happens in the argument of realism. Liberalism argues that intergovernmental bodies and economic groups, corporations, are actually a really important force to consider, and in many cases dangerous and disruptive. It points to positive examples like the EU, which is somewhere between a supernation and an intergovernmental body, a group that actually has legislative power over some of the states, in fact all of the states in its jurisdiction. For instance, education policy, things like that. It can more or less govern. That's a complex issue in itself. There's an entire course at the ANU. I'd recommend it heartily if you like bureaucracy. But you've got other examples like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which over the last 5 years has actually donated more money to, well, it is a charity, so it doesn't donate money to a charity, but has produced more charitable money, or put it to causes, of, you know what I mean, than Australia. In fact, than most nations. It's where the money starts to really become important. However, for negative examples, corporations involved in, say, Africa have caused, arguably, a thing called the race to the bottom idea, where nations that are incredibly destitute are forced to lower constantly living and working standards within their countries to encourage foreign investment. So in order to try and get more money, they're forced constantly to give their people less and less money and worse conditions, just so that effectively human rights abusing companies can actually enter their nation and set up work there. It's an interesting situation, and again, there are counter-arguments to that, but it is one that liberalism argues is very important, whereas realism does not believe that to be so much the case. Now, in the same way that a scientific hypothesis, or the Bureau of Meteorology, attempts to create a hypothesis and predict what's going to happen in the future, so does international relations theory. It really is the same idea. We look at the decisions of the major players and the way that humans can affect things, but we also look at environmental conditions, stuff that we can't affect, and try and figure out what it's going to do in the future. It's not nowadays, though I've sort of made it sound like it, just about avoiding war, but even realist theory is about trying to promote, obviously, peace, but a certain level of cooperation, interdependence, and prosperity through the global community. They just have very different opinions on the way to go about it. Unfortunately, it also, like the Bureau of Meteorology and like scientific experiments, doesn't work sometimes. Sometimes they get their forecast a little bit wrong, or it doesn't work out quite the way they intended. However, unlike a bad science experiment, where money might be wasted, time, in fact, considerable resources can go right down the drain if things go badly wrong, or a weather report which can ruin events, or weddings, or ruin your day, or wet your suitcase, a major stuff-up in international relations theory made by the wrong person can kill millions, and has killed millions. The greatest example, I mentioned it briefly, World War II. You look at a situation where it was IR's first great experiment and its first great failure. This theory that, for a vast number of reasons, all attempts to prosecute liberal theory in an international realm, they failed, and 17 million people died as a result. It's simplified, but that's the crux of it. Look at Vietnam, classic realist defensive theory. This idea of building up allies in a region full of enemies, creating a strong military defense, failed entirely. Well, no, not entirely. But this was all with the purpose of creating peace. Even realist theory, or realist defense theory, argues for the idea of peace through superior firepower. If you've got the guns, they won't try it. As we all know, that worked fantastically in Vietnam, killing hundreds of thousands to millions of people and creating a really wonderful, lasting peace in the area. And I'm sure the people there would agree. For examples that don't include war, look at Ethiopia in 1983 to 1985. Uncontrollable aspects, that is, the climate, and met there with Cold War politics and the civil wars that brought about to create a horrific humanitarian situation, something which people either didn't predict or didn't bother acting on because they didn't expect it to be important. And the result was that 400,000 people starved to death in 2 years. In Rwanda, Zach will be covering this in greater detail, but poorly developed human rights policy through the UN and very poor international theories based on previously applicable circumstances mean that the UN does not intervene effectively, and up to 1 million people are butchered as a result. So if it's so unreliable, why do we study it? And the answer is that sometimes it really does bring about some very fantastic successes. Through the EU, which is a success in progress, is what I like to call it. I'm an EU optimist. There are Eurosceptics who would argue the exact opposite, that it has failed or is failing its entirety. I'm pleased to say I don't believe that. But there is no doubt that it has developed a level of integration that we've never seen before. A group of nations which less than a century ago were fairly bent on butchering each other now work together in a single economic region, practicing and slowly universalizing their policies, universalizing where they can their economies, except when they collapse or have public debt of 160% of GDP, but we don't talk about that here. And, trying to create a prosperous, cooperative global community, or in this case, regional community. The UN, for what it's worth, again, I'm not as optimistic on the UN, but it has made some considerable achievements, given it is working with nearly every nation on the planet. Excuse me. This is, to even have representatives from all those nations in the one room, I'd call somewhat of an achievement in itself. But to have them occasionally pass something worthwhile, I'd call pretty darned impressive. It's sort of a testament to itself that we weren't wiped out in a colossal global thermonuclear fireball sometime in the last 70 years. I would call it a bit rich to place that entirely on the shoulders of international relations theory. I'm sure anyone who studies strategic studies could quite rightly make a case against that, because at the end of the day, a military that gets annihilated will be just as unhappy about the situation as a nation that gets annihilated. However, it is somewhat of a testament to international relations theory, either realist or liberal, that defensive policies nowadays have different swings to them, different ideas that are based almost entirely on averting major wars and crises wherever possible, whereas sometimes provoking them used to be the most common way to get things done. It's still a way to get things done, so I might touch upon in a few minutes. In fact, touch upon right now, pardon me. For a minor case study, if anyone's interested, I would like to talk about the Ukraine. I wasn't originally planning to, but it's pretty good timing for it, to be honest. A fairly quick and, again, sort of simplified dissection of what's gone on there through the lens of international relations. To people who don't know what is going on in Ukraine in any detail, we all know that something's gone wrong and that there are people in the Crimea with big frowny faces on them. It's more or less been in a state of unrest since the fall of the USSR. Liberal theory traditionally calls for the integration of states. The idea that states will slowly conglomerate together wherever they can and create cooperative environments. As I said, we saw the two communities doing this during the Cold War, the East and the West, more or less. And at the fall of the Soviet Union, where Ukraine had, of course, been part of that Eastern Bloc, it was sort of left out in the cold and moved fairly quickly over the last 20 years, that's quickly by international standards, to actually transition to be part of the Western Bloc, which rightly it saw as more prosperous. It's, again, not as simple as that, but that's the best I can do in a fairly short time. Ukraine nowadays is more or less split between Russia and the EU. It had been moving towards the EU slowly over the last 10 or so years. However, due to, I'm going to say, governmental indecision, or rather different governments having completely different opinions on what should be doing, the most recent government, which I might add, was actually fairly elected, arguably. There is always arguments of corruption here and there, but I'm not one to tell you whether or not that's the case. Actually vetoed, or rather not vetoed, but cancelled negotiations to join the EU at the last minute near the end of 2013. That angered about half of the Ukraine, funnily enough, the western half of the Ukraine. That'll become important in a minute. And the results have been riots and mass discontent within a very large portion of the country. This, then, is the crisis that international relations tries its best to prevent. In this case, that was not really done for or due to an idea of realist theory. Liberalist theory, in fact, well, not liberalist theory, but liberal theory argues the best thing to do in the event of a crisis such as this is immediate negotiation. That was attempted, it failed. Realist theory argues that the best thing to do is more or less secure the area. Now, as people might have noticed, one group has now secured an area that it believes to be fairly important. It's now a fairly interesting situation. The crisis happened regardless of people's attempts to stop it. The previous government was overthrown in anywhere between a popular revolution and a military coup, depending on who you ask, or a fascist coup. And now there is a very delicate situation. The two big players here are the European Union and Russia. They've been vying over Ukraine for the last 20 years. The European Union is trying to pull all of Russia's previous allies over to their side. Russia is trying to keep them on their side. And in this case, Russia was losing because Ukraine was about to join. And in the end, nobody got what they wanted because we're now on the verge of a civil war. So the biggest issue here is for Russia. Russia has a land border. Russia here is following classic realist theory. It wants Ukraine back under its control, and it's placed in a position where negotiation has failed because the new government didn't want a word of it, so it's moving in with military forces, because, in part of, I'd say, a very well-calculated gamble, to take as much of the Ukraine as it can and keep it under its control. It has a very strong argument for doing this because, in fact, the only parts of the Ukraine it's occupied to date, in fact, it's Ukraine, not the Ukraine, but I'm going to keep saying that, are, in fact, those with strong Russian ethnic majority. And one of the things we seem to be glossing over in the Western media is that in the Crimea and in most of eastern Ukraine, there is actually general support for the Russian troops in there. So as much as we call it a violation of Ukrainian sovereignty, which it is, it's also one that the people in Ukraine sort of agree on, or in that part of Ukraine. It's a very delicate situation. If my PowerPoint had been working, and unfortunately it wasn't possible, I'd have a wonderful map here which showed the electoral map for the year 2010, shortly before Yulia Tymoshenko was imprisoned on basically trumped-up charges. It showed that in the western half of Ukraine, pretty much every state, with one or two exceptions, or every region, had voted for Yulia Tymoshenko, the pro-European candidate, presidential candidate during the election. In the eastern half of the state, including Crimea, almost everyone had voted for Yukhanovich, or however it's meant to be pronounced. I can't do all that. So, it was a simplified picture, but it gave an obvious impression that it's a state that is torn in two on political lines. It has, however, now created a sort of issue. The major responders here, obviously, the UN, the US, and the EU. The UN is following what the realists say a non-governmental body will do. It didn't work. This is because Russia is on the Security Council. The Security Council is the only one that can respond effectively to this without saying, "You're a bad boy, Russia." So when the UN, if the Security Council wanted to do anything, Russia can just veto it. In this case, the state tells a non-state body to shut up and sit down. There's nothing that body can do about it. However, as I've said, the UN does have other uses. It does sometimes work. The EU is probably the most important responder to Russia's moves here, and as anyone will probably remember if they've been in this room, I've been actually concerned about a war for about the last week. By this point, that's not happening. I'd say the EU and both the EU and the US are following classic realist theory. Again, this is a realist example of what happens when cooperation goes out the window. The EU is saber-rattling at the moment. Russia has won this battle. There is nothing that they can do without themselves provoking a global thermonuclear war to get Russian troops out of Crimea. It's not going to happen. The people there have popular support. It would be a terrible idea to invade that area themselves. So they're going to rattle on about economic sanctions. They're going to get very, very unhappy for a while, and then they'll probably go home. There might be some sanctions passed, but relations will probably normalize inside of 3 or 4 years. They've accepted that a nation here is going to have its sovereignty totally violated by a foreign power for the good of global peace, more or less. Furthermore, the EU has sort of actually won this war, even if Russia has won the battle. It's a strange statement to make, but if you consider it, Ukraine used to be in its entirety under Russian influence. And yet today, Russia has had to deploy its biggest and only remaining strategic trump card, that is, its military, to keep even part of Ukraine under its control. The other half will almost certainly separate and very quickly integrate into the European Union. Western Ukraine now has mass support and is incredibly angry at Russia. So Russia now has moved partly to preserve its military position in the with the Black Sea Fleet, and partly to try and keep part of what it once had. So the situation there is sort of resolved entirely along realist lines. That's more or less a nice example of what international relations theory said. People saw the crisis coming, they tried to stop it, it didn't work. So people have now responded to the crisis where things were escalating quickly towards war and have chosen one of two lines of thinking, in this case realist theory, the idea of stuff Ukraine, that's going to happen, there's not much we can do about it. And they've moved on that line, and now we are, I'd say, actually approaching a resolution, even if the media will continue to bang on about the crisis for another week or two. People have noticed, or will probably notice, that there haven't actually been any interesting updates in the news for a few days. Things are de-escalating on the front. The only thing that could actually go wrong and cause a major war now is the stuff that, like the Bureau of Meteorology, we can't predict. A soldier goes on a shooting spree, somebody gets bad orders, and something really bad goes wrong. The international situation, barring those, so it's done. That's more or less the end of my XSAC, with one final fairly sad note, which is that the unfortunate reality of international relations theory at its current point is that it really doesn't care much about the human in humanity. You might have noticed I talk constantly about states and nations, but really don't mention people at all. And the situation I've just outlined with Ukraine, it does sound workable at that level. But we sort of forget that, of course, in a nation of the Ukraine, there are the people of the Ukraine. and modern realist theory, and to a certain extent modern liberal theory, are perfectly prepared to see the people in the Ukraine suffer so that the state of Ukraine can continue to prosper, continue to exist. And unfortunately, I have absolutely no answer for how the human can be considered in international relations theory. It's like 4 orders of magnitude out. A nation of 20 million people versus 1 or 2 people within that nation sort of doesn't usually matter unless those people are heading the government. I have no answer for how this can work, and sadly, I don't think I'll see one in the future. I hope you've all enjoyed the little, ran longer than I expected, presentation. I hope I haven't bored you all to death. Thank you very much.
Okay, Mark just said it. So generally, and I'm just explaining because this is the first one for the year, and so people may not have been to something like this before. After whoever gives their lecture has talked, there's always a time for just any questions, anything that you found interesting, either on what he was talking about or even just only barely tangentially related to it. So whatever spikes your interest, just feel free to ask Mark.
The other thing worth saying, as I emphasised, hopefully enough during that, it's a very controversial area. Most of what I've said at any given time, there are other schools in international thought, not as major, but still just as valid, who could jump in and say, you're wrong, that's stupid, I disagree. So if you disagree with any of the points I've made,
Feel free to say so.
do actually feel free to say so, and I'll try my best to defend them and consider your opinion.
But we shall do so in a polite and friendly manner.
Except if you're rude,
Then we'll just be judgmental.
Okay.
Do you think this is going to see the return to a multipolar world?
Nah.
Not with the rise of China and this Russia.
When you say this,
to return.
could you define this then?
Ukraine as a starting point for a return to a multipolar world with the rise of China, seeming rise of India, although that's arguably a satellite for China.
India would disagree.
Yeah, India, about 1 billion people might disagree, but yeah, it's interesting stuff.
By a large amount, the largest amount of imports into India are from China.
Oh yeah, look, it's a valid set.
Currently operating more as a satellite, and with Russia's clear intent to return to the world stage as being anti-Western.
So you think,
yeah.
And you're asking, do I think it'll result in a multipolar world?
Mm.
I'd have to say no. I can see
so continuation of unipolar?
I don't think unipolar either. I could believe bipolar. There are huge numbers of different answers to this. It's a great essay question if you like essays. I sort of don't, but you know. With China and the rise of China is a completely separate matter, one that I'm not all that great on. I'd love to be able to actually give you a really detailed answer, but I can't, as far as China is concerned. In fact, I think you probably know a heck of a lot more about it than me. But as far as Russia is concerned, I would call this a last-ditch attempt by Russia to maintain some of what the old Russian bear once had. This was a realist move because, under liberal theory, they were losing, and badly. Russia does not have anything to offer most of the states of Eastern Europe except cultural, solidarity. Cultural solidarity and gas. In fact, no, that's not true. But it's cultural solidarity and raw materials in general. Most of the states most of the post-Soviet states have, of course, seen a period of decline for the first 10 years of post-Soviet activity, market capitalism, followed by a great big boost in economic production. However, particularly Poland and the states that have integrated with the EU, Slovenia, Yugoslavia, or the former Yugoslavia, and the Czech Republic and Slovakia, have seen massive increases compared to the states that have abandoned communism, obviously, they all have, but have not actually integrated with the EU and begun following, or moving with, that is, the European Union. If you look at a state like Slovenia, today, the GDP per capita is certainly not what it is in, say, a nation like France, but considerably better than the average GDP per capita of areas like southern Italy and some of the poorer parts of Spain. I know that doesn't exactly sound like an amazing sell, but given 20 years ago, the average citizen in Italy was out-earning the average citizen in Slovenia by a ratio of about 5 to 1. That's not really a bad improvement. In a state like Belarus, which, of course, it's hard to make those comparisons between a Mediterranean state and a Central Asian Russian state. But nonetheless, in a nation like Belarus, the economy is languishing. It has scarcely improved, and unfortunately for Belarus, the Russian trade union that it's part of has not really done much to improve this situation. Ukraine now finds itself in a bad situation, and I don't believe that Russia's actually got the power to help that at all. I think it's made a move to try and keep political sway over the parts of Ukraine it can salvage, but it's just lost most of Ukraine as something that it can influence.
Do you think we'll see a split Ukraine like we saw in Germany and Berlin?
Absolutely.
Don't mention the wall.
I would put money now on, at the very least, the Crimea seceding. I give that as an absolute certainty. But I reckon most of eastern Ukraine, if not the entire east of Ukraine, is actually going to split along those more or less electoral boundaries. Eastern Ukraine has a great big Russian ethnic, not majority, but great big Russian population. Western Ukraine, not nearly so much. I would not at all be surprised if the nation splits in two. Western Ukraine gets influenced strongly by the EU, and the Eastern Ukraine gets influenced strongly by the Russians. But it's not going to be like East and West Germany. That you will still be able to have free border access, things like that. It's not going to get all Cold War-y on us. No iron curtains here. But they won't be friendly states, to be sure, because of the nature of the breakup. And I suspect West Ukraine is going to be a much nicer place to live, to be honest.
What do you think is the most likely way that that's actually going to come about?
That's a really good question. One I'd like to be able to answer easily. I can't. Crimea is a given. The way it happens in Crimea is this. Russia will probably sit its forces in Crimea until either the Crimean military defects, which is, I suspect, highly unlikely. The Crimean, I suspect it'll pull out in the next fortnight or so, I might add. That is Ukrainian forces in the Crimea at the moment. But Russia will sit there until the revolutionary government in Ukraine is, at the moment it's totally powerless to influence the Crimea. The Crimea is under Russian control. So they will sit there until Crimea has successfully seceded and set up its own independent government, and then they will probably give it a defense treaty, which says, if anyone, Ukraine, attacks you, we will immediately be there to defend you, which is a fancy way of saying, if Ukraine so much as touches the soil of the new, independent, and totally not Russian-affiliated Crimea, we'll crush them like bugs. And that's basically what would happen in a war between the two. For the eastern Ukraine, I'm not so sure. It's not very happy at the situation at the moment. As far as a lot of people in eastern Ukraine are concerned, a democratically elected prime minister was just overthrown by a fascist group called Svoboda. Svoboda, I might add, are a neo-Nazi party in Ukraine. Currently, 3 of the ministers on the Ukrainian cabinet come from Svoboda. So if anyone, I can't pronounce it well, Grisha would be very upset at me. If that sounds bad, it's because it is. In eastern Ukraine, people are concerned about a military or fascist coup. They may break off diplomatically. I'll be interested to see. Pat? Or are you?
Oh, no,
okay.
Nope.
Zach? Shoot, sorry.
There used to be a really big idea in international relations associated with old school realism that posited what they called a great divide between domestic affairs and international affairs. That domestic was just its own little sphere that handled itself, and international was its own little sphere, and never the twain shall meet. Do things like, well, the European Union, obviously, but also issues like which party is controlling Ukraine and which way that's leaning internally, do they suggest a very strong challenge to that divide?
I think that divide, old school realism is more or less not practiced anymore. It tends to represent this idea that humans are inherently evil. We always do the bad thing, that is, we're never friendly, we never cooperate, we always go to war. Because there's a little bit of Satan in each of our souls. It's not quite misrepresented.
Isn't it the same theory that says everyone will always defect and prisoners dilemma?
More or less, yeah. It's not really, that's not totally fair to old school realism. But old school realism is old school, it's out of date. Neo-realism makes more or less the same argument. Everyone always does what's in their self-interest, but it says because the nature of the system forces them to, and I think that's probably slightly more widely accepted than Satan forces them to. As to actually addressing the idea instead of just insulting the theory it's part of.
There's nothing wrong with that homonym.
This theory of state and super-state policy is not widely held anymore because we've seen so much how internal politics within state can either weaken or strengthen or change a state's opinions or capabilities at an international level so much that the two are really strongly ingrained. If you look at the change of government in France in 2011, where Nicolas Sarkozy was replaced with Francois Hollande. It totally changed the way France was acting in the Eurozone crisis. Or it did for about 6 months until Germany sort of negotiated, sort of bullied it back into doing what the original government was doing. But it was a real crisis for a bit for Germany. Well, it didn't make the news so much, because Francois Hollande's very left-wing government originally actually intended to stop agreeing with austerity measures at all, which had been the crux of the Eurozone response to the crisis, and changing halfway through any response, regardless of what that response is usually a really bad idea. So events at a state level affected events at an international level, which in turn would have then bounded straight back on the state. If the state makes a decision and then integrates that at an international level, says, no, we'll stop working with you on this one, Germany, it's not happening, and then your economy goes down the toilet because of it, and then you get voted out, what that creates is a really quick cycle of nothing working. And the two of them are so closely interrelated that I don't think anyone can argue nowadays that they have nothing to do with each other.
Just a really broader question.
Yeah, sure.
International relations or political science is a science. In any science, you want to have repeatable experiments. Do you think that this is actually true in political science? Do you have repeatable experiments?
I think it falls more under social sciences, where it's more focused towards theories, which have been
theories
proved,
Just let him finish this.
proved through numbers and doing quantitative research. That's more where the science comes in as opposed to qualitative, which is...
And further on that point, usually what political science does is they'll create what they call a model, where they say, if we assume that the following is true, so basically give a hypothesis, if we assume that this hypothesis is true, this is what we would expect to see. So far so good, this is the scientific method as we know it. Then they will pull out a whole lot of statistical data saying, okay, is this what we see? Now, it's not quite as controlled as in a nice, pure, preferably mathematical science where you can isolate it down to a singular variable. But it is much the same process of, here's what would make sense, here's something that we can test, not because we'll create it, but because we would expect to see it. Here's the evidence that either corresponds with or disproves our theory.
Nonetheless, it's an interesting question, because particularly in realist theory, there is still a very strong idea that nothing actually really changes in international relations, and that certain trends, if not certain particular experiments, because of the way borders change, people change, and technology, everything in history has sort of been changing a bit. But realism states that the trend doesn't change, and that trend is a trend towards conflict. It states that while individual experiments, if you will, individual interactions are not repeatable, the trend that they lead to, that is one of conflict and people not getting along so great, is repeatable. And in fact, it's not only repeatable, but it's not avoidable. It will always happen. We'll always trend back to this theme of conflict and discord. And its main thing is, or nowadays, is by not being friends, we actually avoid conflict as long as possible, because everyone works in their own interest, and that interest nowadays means not being at war. In the future, it might still mean being at war, but it's a way of trying to keep that cycle of we get back into a war as slow as we can.
So entropy.
Yeah, it's sort of state-based entropy. Yeah.
Except that we're really trying to avoid the heat death, because this isn't simply the absence of heat as the overwhelming presence.
Well, no, see, the heat death of the universe is going back to when the UN will actually pass major legislation. On that note, I think I'll probably finish up if there are any more questions.
I was wondering, you said how you could get humans into international relations and stuff like that, rather than looking at nations, a view which could kind of look at the humans inside the nations and be more beneficial for the humans. Would you think that, I know that you said that you're not going to make any judgments on what could work to bring this about, but would you think that if the whole concept of nations and countries was taken away and a kind of a global, totally globalized world was to happen ideally, would you think that the human would be looked at more, like would have a better status in as it does now, kind of thing?
I think it's a fantastic question, but unfortunately, it's one I can't answer because all modern international relations theory relies on the international part. It looks at the interactions between states. And while I would like to hope that in a theoretical global superstate, the human became a more important part of the subject of humanity, at the same time, absolutely nothing I've learned could really be all that applicable there because there would no longer be an international relation to examine. Worth mentioning, there are, of course, major groups in international relations theory which do try their best to bring some form of lens back onto the human in humanity. The biggest example is probably the UNHCR, United Nations Human Rights Council.
Yeah.
UNHCR. I'll get it right eventually.
I think it is Human Rights Council in English,
Okay.
but
Well, yeah, we sort of get the idea.
And they take security approaches such as, like, as opposed to realism or liberalism, some more closet ones, like a closet end there is not very popular, like human security, food security, and women, environmental and women's security.
But, and in the same way, you say closet, which is probably a really great statement, because if you're with a group of international relations experts, you sort of have to come out of the closet to tell them that that's the area you're studying. It doesn't have much respect, unfortunately. All right, I think we'll probably end it there, but thank you very much.